The Texas Longhorn cattle are about as much a part of the great state of Texas as pickup trucks and cowboy hats are. But as much as this massive ranching cattle has become synonymous with the South, it is even more fascinating when looked at under the microscope. A true marvel of nature, this massive beauty, with its distinctive horns that grace many a mantle, is one of the few cattle species in existence that came to be without human intervention at all. You heard that right. For all of mankind's obsessive need to selectively breed unusual and sometimes outrageous attributes, one of the most stunning livestock on the ranch was a complete accident. And like nature usually does, it bested humans by a landslide. We, with all of our brains and our liking for the gracious, could never have thought up a specimen as majestic as the Texas Longhorn. So let's get into the history and the characteristics of this fascinating breed. Like always, we start at the very beginning. In the late 1400s, Spanish explorers brought their Moorish and Andalusian cattle over to North America to feed the first settlers. A bit of unregulated breeding and a few thousand miles traveled further south, and the Spanish then settled down in what would later become Texas. Some say that the thin-legged Andalusian breeds landed in the Caribbean first before moving on to Texas. One thing is certain, those Andalusians that landed in the Caribbean did supply the main breeding line for fighter bulls in the ring, and whether or not the Andalusians that came from the Caribbean or the North eventually became the Texas Longhorns later, a fair amount of unregulated breeding definitely changed them before they got to the Lone Star State. Once there, they either escaped their owners, or they were simply abandoned on lands to fend for themselves as the explorers moved from one place to the next. The stragglers managed to find each other, forming new herds, and these forgotten orphans began to adapt and acclimate to the harsh environment of the Texan plains like no one could have predicted. The Andalusian stock in them gave them long legs that were ideal for scaling the uneven terrain. The darker coat provided them protection from the scorching sun, and that mean temper that got them into the fighting ring in the first place gave them enough spice to survive the elements and fight off predators. But most of all, they began to grow enormous horns, ideal for fighting both predators and the thick bush and brambles that got in the way of the little food that was growing on the plains. And as their horns got larger to forage better, so did their bodies. Fast forward to the 1840s, when the Mexican War rolled by, the Texas Longhorns were a breed distinguishable by both their visual attributes as well as their unique taste. These once domesticated cattle now resembled something wilder and leaner, both inside and out. A few more years later, and the American Civil War behind their backs, people began to recognize the Texas Longhorn as a very viable livestock to have in the South. They were one of the few breeds that could survive the harsh environment, and they were fertile enough to keep up with the rising demand for beef. Due to their durability and the sheer size to which they grew, they managed to carve out a very desirable place in the market, despite not being as rich in fat as the other breeds. This is partly where the term cowboy comes from. After the war, the soldiers returned to find land to settle on where they could forget about the horrors of war. In Texas, the millions of longhorns now running around weren't owned by anyone, and therefore unbranded. They hired men to flush out the wild longhorns from the brush and herd them up north. The hours were grueling, and the only time these bush poppers, as they were sometimes called, got out of the saddle at all was when they slept. Predators took their share, both from the cattle and the men, but the bandits were even worse. It took a specific caliber of man to be able to live on the plains and brave the harsh realities of the Wild West, not to mention handling the wild longhorns. They're prone to stampeding at the slightest provocation, and the men themselves were run into the ground if the herd of panicked cattle steamrolled into them. Oftentimes, when a cowboy was unlucky enough to land under those deadly hooves, nothing was left of him to find. The steer's hooves tore the bodies apart, and what little was left was driven so deep into the ground that it constituted a burial in and of itself. The herd, sometimes thousands of heads at a time, would get so frenzied that the heat that emanated from them could be felt yards away. All of those hooves stamping into the ground and the horns slamming into each other sounded like thunder blazing across the plains, and it could be heard from miles away. The intensity of herding them and the mighty price that they brought when they reached their destination kept them on the circuit for a good few years. But it would be that incredible hardiness and their high fertility rates that would become their downfall. They were bred with the short horn varieties, which had the desirable fat content, but not the hardiness required to survive the open field. The USA wanted fat, marbled beef, and the Longhorns just didn't bring that one aspect to the table. Those newer breeds began to dominate the market, phasing out the Longhorn. The fact is that fenced-in pastures were making their natural survival impossible. There just wasn't anywhere for them to survive without humans left. As you can imagine, their numbers began to plummet, and the famed cowboys and their intense months-long treks across America no longer became necessary to keep the public fed. The cowboys died out, but a handful of Longhorns managed to hang on for dear life, mostly because Texans are proud and sentimental. The ranchers that kept them did it mostly for that good old Texas pride, not for the money they could make from them. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what their numbers looked like, but we can be sure that they numbered only a few hundred by the 1920s. Either way, a few nature reserves took them on too, where they could live in parks and range freely as their original feral ancestors did. But it wasn't until well into the 80s that renewed interest in healthier food began to change their protection status. You see, people weren't interested in getting as much fat from a head of cattle as they could. We wanted healthier food. Meat that was higher in protein and lower in fat now had more value on the market, so the Longhorns provided the taste of beef, but with less fat for the health-conscious population, and the rangers couldn't be happier to keep more of them on. These self-sufficient grazers needed less care, and therefore less monetary expenses to keep, making the final product almost pure profit. They'd never reach the value of their high-fat counterparts, but there is a market for them now, and that is always the deciding factor in whether or not a breed hangs around. In 2013, there were roughly 2,000 heads living in the US, and that number's doubled since then. So let's take a look at what the physical attributes that developed during those 400 years left in the wild have done for the Texas Longhorn. Let's start with the most obvious, those big horns. Actually, everything is bigger with the Longhorns. Starting with the horns, they can easily reach 90 inches. The biggest set of horns clocked in at 130 inches. To give you some perspective on just how huge their horns are, a 6-foot-tall man could lie within the crook of its horns, and his head and ankles would barely tickle either end. Females have horns too, though they aren't nearly as impressive as their fellows are. Fully grown bulls can weigh anywhere between 1,800 and 2,200 pounds, whereas heifers usually stay steady between 1,000 and 1,400 pounds. 50 to 60 inches from the hoof to the top of the head is a good average height estimate, but don't be surprised if you get a gigantic bull every now and then that gets close to a ton in weight. Seriously, never underestimate how incredibly large these guys can get. And that size translates to longevity too. Most bovine species average around 10 years before their natural death occurs, not the Longhorns though. They'll comfortably see double that amount. With lead steers working up until they're 20 years now, all of that size means a heck of a lot of meat to work with. Like we mentioned, the leaner quality of the product makes it more comparable to game. It sure tastes like beef would, just without all of that natural oils that come from the fat. It's probably the healthiest beef in the United States just for that reason alone. And quite frankly, it's a relief to find beef in its purest form, just the meat. We've bred out cattle to be as fatty as possible, chasing that marbling. But all of that richness isn't good for us or the animal itself. It's one of the biggest contributors to why Longhorns live so much longer, and it should be the reason you live longer too. And their value doesn't end with their carcass. Heifers have no problem keeping their calves fed, and they even have a little to spare for you too. Though not a milking breed by any means, a household can be sustained by a cow or two with much more nutritious milk than other non-milking breeds. Their horns can fetch an attractive price on the market, and their coats too. Since they come in so many colors, they make for excellent rugs and decorative pieces. In some ways, the horns and hides are more profitable than the meat is. Patches, speckles, spots and blotches, those multicolored hides can come in shades of brown, black, white, red, cream, and just about everything in between. The leather they produce is excellent, but the hide as a whole is so beautiful that it would almost be a shame to remove the coloring for a pair of sturdy boots. Rodeos, parades, and showroom auctions will never show you the door if you have a specimen to show off. Renting out the live animal for these purposes is a very lucrative sideline if you're willing to take the time to train a bull for optimal docility and obedience. Heifers give birth easily and almost never require help from human handlers. Their calves are smaller than you'd expect the massive longhorns to produce, but don't be too worried about that. It's a nifty little trick of nature to ensure that birthing can be done easier and with less complications if the calf is a little smaller. Those babies grow so fast and with a mother that protects them so fiercely, they catch up to the rest in no time at all. Longhorns are best left to their own devices. They can find the food they need, birth their calves, and protect themselves with as little input from you as a cow could possibly want. They didn't make it 400 years in the wild without human intervention for nothing. As is typical of heritage breeds and livestock that veer away from domestication, their growth is decidedly slower than other cattle breeds. This is offset greatly by the fact that they need so little human care and bought for feed. Not giving out the money for grains and veterinary care is going to take you much farther in the long run than waiting a few more months before taking them to slaughter. Self-sustainability and disease resistance that's second to none make them the ideal animal to keep in the desert and sparse brush conditions of the American South. Yes, you'll need space to keep them, and preferably next to a natural body of water, because big animals need a lot of water. If you don't have a natural source of water on your property, you need to prepare yourself to supply each individual animal with 30 gallons of water a day during the hottest months. If it's the case that you have water and space, well then you can't ask for a cheaper, more low-maintenance animal to keep. The only real concern at the end of the day is to build an overhang for the herd to take shelter under during wind and hail storms, or if it gets a little chilly in winter. They probably won't use it though. Longhorns get all the protection they need from huddling close to each other, with the biggest steers holding the fort on the outskirts of the herd, keeping the heifers and their young safe in the middle. This brings us to their temperaments. Highly intelligent and under good training, they will be very docile creatures to care for, but no matter what you do, they will always be easily spooked. And that's where the complications start. Even the slightest scare to one animal can cause the rest to flare up and run. Stampedes are no joke. These herds can plow through fences, ravines, and even you if they have to, sometimes running themselves to near death from exhaustion. We weren't kidding when we said that they can literally give off heat when they get worked up. The old cowboys recorded that it felt like they'd stepped into a furnace, and that their faces and arms became red from the heat that radiated from a worked-up herd gave off. They can be easily trained to adhere to a milking and sleeping schedule, but even a distant yip from a coyote is enough to set them off into a full run. And then all of that gentleness goes right out the window. That's why they need so much space. It's not that they're rambunctious like goats are. If anything, they can be quite lazy and chilled out. But once they get going, they need to be able to run themselves dry without trampling people, fences, and other animals underfoot. Given their volatile nerves that can spring up so unexpectedly, it's easy to become complacent and forget just how dangerous they can be. So children and new hands must never be left unsupervised, even when they're herded through chutes. Even a calm bull can cause death with its horns by just turning its head. And then we get to space and the environment. Longhorns need things dry and virtually uninhabitable. They thrive in places that would wipe out other breeds. They can handle seasonal rains, windstorms, and even a little cold. But areas above the equator will just be too consistently cold, snowy, and muggy for them to handle. In deep snow, and with their hooves constantly wet, you can kiss all of that disease resistance goodbye. Winters with more snow than down south will require heated shelters for them to stay in during the night and when storms hit. and those shelters need to have beveled or non-slip surfaces. Out in the field, they are sure-footed, but indoors, a fall can easily cause a broken leg or trampling by their flatmates. The rough forage ranges of Texas are the perfect example of the environments in which they are the happiest. You can push them into full-on desert conditions too, as long as they can forage for their own food. No matter how little you think there is for them, they'll find all they need from the earth. If the winters are a little too harsh to sustain them, then you can supplement their feed with hay, but it will never be in excessive amounts. Ideally, vast amounts of space, their own feed, and a natural body of water, and you've got a gold mine on your hands. But if any of those factors get taken out of the equation, then your problems begin to pile up. This is not the kind of breed that can be experimented with. They know their conditions and they want to stay in them. If you don't have the acreage and your budget can't sustain bringing in water if the well goes dry, then don't attempt to keep Longhorns. And if your acreage is on the smaller side, don't go below a dozen heads at a time. Longhorns need their own kind. Without enough friends to huddle up to, they'll become skittish and unhappy. Like us, they are social creatures, and their safety is always at the forefront of their being. This is a big animal, suited for a big piece of land. Medical care will be minimal. But on the rare occasion that a calf needs help, getting to the baby is a nightmare. That heifer will protect her young, no matter how well she knows and trusts you. At that moment, you are just as much an enemy to her as any other predator. Outside of that, the usual parasite control and an overall checkup of the herd should be enough to keep them content. At the end of the day, if your conditions are ideal, then the pros outnumber the cons by a landslide. Cheap, less veterinary care, self-sufficient, and the amount of profit they bring from their various uses is more than almost every other cattle breed. Beef, a little bit of milk, quick breeding, sellable skins and horns, and high-value pageantry. They check every box, and they do it in the least expensive way possible. The cons, on the other hand, shouldn't come as a surprise. Space and rough forage conditions are crucial. There just isn't room for cramped conditions. And the housing required for colder climates becomes so heavy on the pocket that it becomes a little nonsensical to rear Longhorns then. And time is the biggest factor. If you were looking to pump out a great deal of produce in the shortest amount of time, then there are other breeds that are much better suited for your wants. A heifer will take 1.5 to 2 years before she becomes of breeding age, and when she's bred, gestation takes around 280 days, and you won't reach slaughter weight in less than a year. We think that there is more to gain from the Texas Longhorn than almost any other breed of cattle we've ever covered on this channel. It's that Texas patriotism that kept them around this long, but it's their inexpensive rearing and the huge variation of their products that's going to give them a few 100 years more on our lands. And what more could you want in a steer? They're supersized in all ways, on the plate, in the pageant, and hanging in the parlor. The Texas Longhorn deserves every bit of praise that it's given. And now, like always, we leave the floor to you, our audience. Have you reared or come into contact with these mighty beasts of the plains? What were your experiences like, and did we miss any details? Or are you thinking of opening up your fields for a herd of your own? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to leave a like and to subscribe so you don't miss any uploads from us in the future. See you next time. Cheers.